episode number 40. My name is Michael Boldin. I'm joined by my good friend,
Michael Maharrey.
Mike, today is day 572 on our counter of keeping track of what the GOP has failed to get rid of, things like Obamacare, federal gun control, mass warrantless surveillance, and a bunch of other stuff. So today, I think we're going to talk a little bit about that problem, because a lot of people who support the Constitution and liberty, we often hear from them, or we hear from groups they follow, organizations, that at the end of the day, it's always better to support Republicans over Democrats because somehow Democrats are going to slow the train down. Republicans are going to slow the train down, and things aren't going to be as bad as if they're Democrats. But on four of the main issues, and I think we should cover others in the future, on four of the main issues that we watch over time, or we have for quite a long time, Republicans have not only been as bad as Democrats, but actually worse. So today we're going to talk about federal gun control, federal spending, war powers, and even calls for censorship. That's kind of a slightly related one, obviously more topical than what we've seen in recent times. But let's get into this first article on federal spending. This was done by a new TAC blogger, Andrew Tylock. Mm-hmm. Welcome to the team, Andrew. That's pretty awesome. This is really good research. And Mike, okay, the title is Big Spenders Get Worse Every Year, The History of Growth Since 1940. Give us a quick overview of what's going on.
So what Andrew did is I had him go and look at the federal spending. So this is actual spending, dollars outlaid, total dollars. And to try to find that going back over a number of presidential administrations. And to add to that, to make it more relevant, to make sure that it was adjusted to inflation so that all of the dollars were equal. So basically, when you look at this list of presidents and the amount of money that were spent in each of their terms, this is in 2009 dollars. So you can compare Eisenhower with Carter, with Ford, and it's a real comparison.
So you're basically pegging it to one flat variable instead of just the number, because the number in the earlier years before inflation would have been significantly smaller. So if you peg it all at that 2009 rate, why did you pick 2009?
Because that's the
data that's available.
That's what if I remember correctly, it's actually a federal data source.
Okay.
Federal government data source, and that's what they pegged it to. They pegged it to $2009. So we went back to, and this particular chart went back to 1940.
Roosevelt.
So it's the middle of the Roosevelt administration.
Mm-hmm.
And what we find is that every single administration spent more money in actual dollars, comparing apples to apples, than the president before him. So President Clinton spent more money than President Bush. And President Bush, number two, spent more money than Clinton. Obama spent more money than Bush. And as we have 1 year of Trump behind us, Trump has already spent more money in his first term, or as they project it forward, will spend more money than President Obama.
So if $1 equals $1 as it did in 2009, FDR, this is obviously no constitutionalist. This is a guy that is considered by many in conservative circles to be kind of the godfather of the progressive movement today. Maybe Teddy Roosevelt was another one, Woodrow Wilson, but FDR is considered one of the worst of the worst. Well, President Trump has been spending 7 times the amount. 7 times the
Isn't that
amount
insane?
as FDR.
And think of
FDR as the small government guy, you'd get laughed out of most conservative circles. But in comparison, well, there is no comparison. And it's not just Trump. I don't want to just pick on the current guy, but that's the easy one to do. But Barack Obama was like 6.8 times. It's so massive. George W. Bush, slightly smaller than that. So each year, I'm looking at these numbers, and Mike, you'll put a link in the show notes, I'm sure. Everyone from Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, every single one, there is no dip. It never goes down, the amount of spending.
Exactly. And so, you look at Roosevelt, this is during World War II, right? World War II coming out of the Great Depression. So with all of the New Deal things that were implemented by the Roosevelt, he spent $512.1 billion. And Trump,
that's
so
average
far,
yearly spending, right?
that's average yearly spending. Okay. Exactly. So what I did here is I actually went through and did this chart, and then Andrew wrote the analysis to go with it. But what I did is I took each president's administration, I added up all, it had it by year. So I added up each year of their spending and then divided it by the number of years they were in office. So from 1940 to 1944, when Roosevelt died, he spent $512 billion. And Trump, which is just 1 year, spent $3.5 trillion. So
yeah, it's insane. And, I often make a joke. I'm like, I think about, because my political activism started much later in life than most people. I was totally apathetic, like many people are. I've never voted. I definitely was not interested in any of what the political sham parties were throwing at us. I thought there was just felt wrong, just instinctually felt wrong. My instincts were also very socialist, though. I didn't like because in some ways, I wanted government to do more. But as I learned, when government does more, it's worse.
Right.
But I never would have guessed. I never, ever in my life would have heard myself saying Bill Clinton was the small government guy of our generation. It's almost laughable. I mean, it is. But in comparison to what we have today, to George Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, Bill Clinton did almost nothing as far as spending goes. Now, what are some of the arguments against this? Like, okay, well, there's more population now than there was when Roosevelt was around. Is it that significant? Have you looked at this?
The argument that I got, the most pushback that I saw in this article actually said that it's really not a good comparison to compare absolute dollars. They did talk about, some people did mention the population thing, but their argument is that we should compare the spending as a percentage of GDP.
Why?
So in other words, you take how much money the administration spent, and then you look at it compared to the actual size of the economy.
But why?
Well, because it gives you an idea as the population grows, as the economy grows, obviously the government is going to have to spend more money.
Why should it spend more money? I guess
I don't know.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is like
my argument.
I know, but and I'm not playing devil's advocate, and maybe I'm an idiot. I know I'm ignorant on a lot of the economic things. I've tried really hard to get through Man, Economy, and State. I've read a lot of other Rothbard, and I've read some Mises. I read The Great Depression, his book on the Great Depression. But I can't understand the logical basis for just because the economy is. So all things being equal, if no federal programs are cut, then as population grows, federal spending would get greater. I can see that argument. If all federal programs are the same, then federal spending would go up as population increased. But why would federal spending go up just because the economy grew? That to me sounds like the government is getting greedier.
Well, and I can tell you the fundamental problem with this analysis. And I think the reason that people want to use that is because they can pick apart those numbers, because if you look at the GDP growth compared to government spending growth, it's not a straight line trajectory. There's some dips during the Clinton years. The spending as a percentage of GDP actually dropped to some degree. So I think people like to use that number because it makes whatever case they're trying to make. Here's the problem with using GDP as the comparison. GDP includes government spending.
Oh,
right. So GDP is actually the total of all output. So when the government gives, a certain amount of money to somebody, to some program or to a defense contractor, right? Okay. So the government buys tanks. That's figured into part of the GDP. So I think personally that looking at just the flat spending is really a better way to show that trajectory of The government is getting bigger. It's doing more. It's spending more money. And if you look at that GDP trend, I actually worked out the numbers on this just out of curiosity. And there is, like, if you graphed it, it would look kind of like this. So you'd have some peaks and dips, but if you go from Roosevelt to Trump, there is an upward trajectory. It's spending more in terms of GDP as well as spending more in absolute dollars. So no matter how you cut it, the government's getting bigger, the government's spending more money, the government's more involved in the economy, and it doesn't matter whether or not you have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. And, you know, it's funny. Think about this. Everybody wants to talk about how awful Carter was and how great Ronald Reagan was. Ronald Reagan spent more money than Jimmy Carter.
Right. So I guess I would even just look one more time at population. And I'm looking here. I just pulled this up. Population, U.S. Census 1940 was 132 million. So significantly smaller than today. I think today, what is it? I don't know. 300 million?
I think it's
282 million is what it says in 2000. So it's double the size, let's say roughly double the size of population from 1940 to 2000. But then, so who is president in 2000? George W. Bush?
Yeah.
So that would mean W should have spent about $1 trillion a year. Roosevelt was $512 billion, so $500 billion. So if federal programs stayed the same and there was double the population, it would that's not even taking into consideration that as you spend more on a larger supply chain, you generally have to spend less per person. So even setting that aside, it should be about double, so about $1 trillion. But Bush, too, spent $2.6 trillion. That means there's way more government programs, and I think that's the message that we take here, that it doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats in Washington, D.C. I know a lot of those Congresses were Democrats, but you had some Republican presidents who could have vetoed everything. I know Reagan vetoed quite a bit. But then when you get to times like Bush 2, it just keeps growing. And now the Trump administration is all Republicans. And this is what really kind of got us looking at these numbers, because back in March, Trump signed that $1.3 trillion omnibus spending bill that was passed by the Republicans.
Right.
So I think the spending is incredibly dangerous. And if people keep saying, oh, just elect Republicans, vote R, and it's not going to get worse, is absurd.
Yeah, and let's look at this metric. Let's talk about deficits just for a second. So for anybody who, sometimes people get confused with the terms. You've got the debt.
I know I do.
And the deficit. Okay, so the deficit is the amount of money that the government spends every year over and above the revenue that it collects. So put it in simple terms, let's say that the government brought in $100 of revenue and it spent $110, then the deficit is $10. So it's the amount of money basically that the federal government has to borrow. That's the deficit. The federal debt is the sum of all of the deficits. So every year that there's a deficit, that adds that much to the overall debt. If you look at just deficit spending, the Trump administration is approaching, the way it's projected with looking at revenues and spending, the deficit. So that's just the yearly, what we're spending over what we're taking in, is going to approach $1 trillion. So we're going to be adding $1 trillion annually to the federal debt.
How much was it under Obama? Do you know offhand?
I don't. I do know that the deficit is bigger. That Trump is running bigger deficits under
per year
than Obama. But deficits, again, those are the kind of things when you look at the trajectory, it depends on what's going on
But it never actually becomes a positive. They're always spending more than they have.
Actually, during the Clinton administration, he did run some surpluses.
Okay, so once again, the absurdity of the anti-constitutionalist, the nonsense, the horrible Bill Clinton, who is bad on foreign policy and domestic policy. Very little did he do was in line with the Constitution, maybe nothing. The idea that here's the one guy that maybe at one point didn't spend more money than they had.
Yeah, and the reason for that is that was, you figure, during the Clinton administration was
Newt, right?
It was the end. Well, it was the end of the Cold War. So there was a drastic wind down in defense spending as things kind of ratcheted back.
Well, that's probably why they felt like they had to ratchet it back up to increase the spending. And that brings me to, did you have more you want to cover on that?
I just wanted to make one more point about the deficits that we're seeing currently. Normally, you see deficit spending increase when the economy is bad. And there's several reasons for this. Part of it is that more people need benefits. But then the other end of that is that governments tend to engage in deficit spending to stimulate the economy. It's that whole Keynesian economic thing that the world is run on. Right now, we're seeing Trump deficits that are looking like deficits you would normally see during the peak of a crisis. And we're supposedly in an economic boom. So the amount of debt that's being added onto what already exists is absolutely phenomenal and honestly somewhat unprecedented for a time that we're supposed to be in economic good times. So I just throw that out there because, there's this idea that the economy's great and Trump saved the economy and everything's great. If you really look at the metrics of what's going on, the economy is built on a giant pile of debt, personal debt, corporate debt, and government debt.
It is a nasty, dangerous house of cards because what's going to be the solution in a climate of total economic ignorance? I'm pretty good on this stuff, and I'm ignorant. Like, I don't know much, but a lot of people in the general public know far less on this than I do. Yep. They really believe that the solution to fix these problems is more government. So eventually this stuff is going to have to be paid. They're not going to pay it. They're going to, government people aren't going to pay it. They're not going to get it from their corporate buddies that back their campaigns. They're definitely not going to get it from those people. They're going to come and try to get it from us. And they're going to get it from us through the creepy, insidious, dangerous, hidden tax of inflation. They're going to devalue the dollar just by printing more. They give it to their buddies in the corporate world, in the military contractors, government contractors of all stripes. They get it first, and then as it trickles down to the rest of the economy, it becomes less and less valuable. And that means our spending power is lower, and they just have more dollars. That's the only way that they can keep this rolling, and it keeps screwing over the average person. And eventually, they're going to start calling for nationalization of various industries to fix the problem. It's definitely going to happen. It's going to be more and more socialism called for, whether it actually comes to fruition or not. But this is part of the problem. If you don't stop the spending, we're always screwed. And Mike, you do a lot of great work over at Schiff Gold. I know Peter Schiff has been talking about this quite a bit, about how, tax cuts are great. Tax cuts, of course. I'd like to see tax cuts to zero. Yeah, of course. But tax cuts without spending cuts are insane.
Yeah, we need government relief more than we need tax relief. And the point that he makes is the exact point that you just made. We have to pay for the government.
I listened to his podcast.
Yeah. So we're either going to inflate our way out of it, or we're going to tax our children to death. I guess if you don't have children, it doesn't matter. But I have children, so I'd rather not see my children paying,
mind you, we're already taxed to death.
Well, yeah, of course we are.
If you look at it, the numbers, that the overall amount of tax that people pay on all the various levels, I've seen numbers anywhere from 40 to 60% of your income goes to some kind of taxation. Whether it's property tax, gas tax, telephone company tax, everything you're paying has some kind of tax. A lot of them are federal mandates, requirements. So like your telephone, your cell phone, there's like 3-4 different lines of taxation. A lot of them are federal taxes. Now, it's not a huge percentage, but all these various things add up, and they keep getting you more and more and more. This is a significant amount. And if you look at the tax on tea that the revolutionaries opposed, the comparison is absurd. The fact that people are so ignorant to the fact that these are so damaging to society that people aren't up in arms is almost silly. But it's sad. It is very sad. But the federal spending is getting worse and worse and worse, and that's one of the 4 things we're going to cover today. That one I think is the most complex. One of the other ones, Mike, and I know we talked about this already a little bit, but you did a great report about gun control enforcement. Of course, One of the other big issues that people say you have to have the NRA-backed guy in Washington, D.C., and I covered this a little bit on my Monday, Wednesday, Friday live stream over on YouTube. We do this on Facebook, but on YouTube on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Good Morning Liberty, I talked about this report that you put together, Mike. The Trump administration ramps up enforcement of federal gun laws, and I know a lot of Trumpsters always Trump. I would call everyone always or never Trump, having Trump derangement syndrome. Let's just keep going with that, where people who will make excuses pro or con are in a real bad place. But people, now, of course, people will disagree with this because they're like, but Trump isn't doing this. And the numbers, Mike, you put together, that in every category has been an increase of enforcement action over Barack Obama. And Barack Obama was supposed to be the horrible gun grabber. So if the NRA-backed Republican president with a Republican Congress can't do anything about the ATF, what's the point?
I don't know. I'm completely flummoxed by this. I was also overwhelmed by the number of angry emails I got over this. I mean, first off, just say, well, this just can't be true. You know, like I made the numbers up. I didn't. I mean,
where did you get them, Mike?
I got them from the ATF.
Yes, ATF puts out a fact sheet every single year. We link to them in the article. They're in the footnotes. You can click on 2014 through 2017, and the ATF tells us how many enforcement actions they do, how much it costs, like how many prosecutions, how many they investigate. We've got all the numbers right from the ATF.
Yep. And you know, firearms is at the end of it. You know, it's alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. But firearms is by far the majority of the enforcement. They ought to call it firearms, tobacco, and alcohol. And so when you look at these numbers, it's almost all enforcement of federal gun laws.
Like 90%, right? 92%?
Yeah, I think it was 92%. And we need to remember that all of these federal gun control laws are unconstitutional. I mean, the ATF shouldn't even exist. So it boggles my mind when I'm getting angry emails from people telling me, well, you know, Trump's just doing what he's supposed to do. He has to enforce the law. No, he really doesn't. I mean,
well, actually, I agree. Trump has to enforce the law.
Yes, he does.
The law is the Constitution, and anything else should not be enforced. Now, anyone who is supposedly saying they're a gun rights supporter, all of a sudden in favor of the ATF, then I would have to say this whole strategy is the best strategy for gun control people ever. Because if enforcement under the gun grabber is resisted and under the NRA-backed guy is not, then there's I mean, we only have 1 year, so it'll be interesting to see how this plays out year over year. I mean, obviously, I think of it this way. Like if I'm driving 80 miles an hour and all of a sudden it says, you know, there's a speed trap and it's 35. You're not at 35 immediately, even though you slam on the brakes. Sometimes you keep increasing in speed. Sometimes that momentum is hard to stop. There's a lot of things going on. My hope, I'm just going to stay positive. My hope is that we get this. Well, first of all, let's look over this information and then we'll go over the hope. So I highlighted a few things that I did on my show yesterday. And this is from your article, Mike. During Trump's first term, ATF enforcement of federal gun laws increased in every single category compared to the last year Obama was in the White House. We can start with the number of firearms cases investigated. The number investigated. In 2016, they investigated 31,853. And in Trump's first year, 35,302. That's a 10% increase. More prosecution. There were about 800 more cases recommended for prosecution, about 800 more indicted, and about 600 more convicted. So more convictions, more indictments, more prosecution recommendations, more investigations, more everything. And even the number of investigations. So this is when you were talking. I'm sorry to ramble, and then I'm going to let you roll with this because the numbers are massive and they're really, really bad. So we were talking about the number of investigations, the percentage going towards firearms. Under Obama, they were 90%. Under Trump, 92%.
Yeah. So every single category, and you know, whenever I started getting pushback from this, and people might be surprised that are watching this, just how much pushback. I don't know that there's. Yeah, maybe some of the incorporation doctrine stuff, but this has been one of the most controversial things that I've written in a long time, as far as just people being viscerally angry. And I guess
it's not controversial.
It's not controversial. And this is what I told people. The numbers don't lie. I mean, nobody could come back and challenge the numbers. So they had to make up ridiculous arguments like, well, you know, I guess it's like the different issue, but it's like the lady who said that it was okay for him to propose $12 billion bailout for farmers because he didn't really mean it. So I guess he doesn't really mean to enforce these federal gun laws.
Well, people are being prosecuted and they're going to jail for violating federal gun laws, which shouldn't exist.
And that's the bottom line. I mean, you really can't put it any simpler. And, you know, and I really tried to be careful when I ran these numbers, and I tried to make sure that I was being fair and that I was not manipulating anything or, you know, taking anything
what's to manipulate?
out of context.
The numbers are numbers. I mean,
Exactly.
The ATF is telling us how much they're enforcing, how many actions they're doing. All it is just the raw data, and we're just comparing it from year to year.
Yeah, exactly. So, you know, if people want to get angry, I guess that they need to look at their own
Of course.
motivations and
Anyone who's pissed at the fact of that, if they're not pissed about the fact that the enforcement numbers have gone up, they're the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, they might as well be Michael Bloomberg in my book.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they're okay. They're okay with the fact that the ATF has gotten worse than they were under Obama. They're okay with it. They're willing to turn a blind eye to it. So that means they're the problem. If the so-called gun rights people aren't willing to challenge this, they aren't gun rights people.
Yeah, absolutely.
It really pisses me off when people are so weak-spined like that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and it does me too. And I wrote a little article. I can't remember. I don't even know if we published it yet. I can't remember what's been published and what hasn't. But I wrote an article that talked about that very thing, that you should be angry at anybody who is not enforcing the Constitution, who is not following the law of the land. Your outrage should be directed at those people, no matter who they are, no matter what party that they're in, because this is the standard. And if you are walking away from that standard because it's your guy or because you want to make up some excuse,
they have no principles.
You have no principles. That's exactly right.
So my hope, let's get back to that. My hope is that you can't stop everything, right? So my view, first of all, is the worst case scenario should, when the gun rights guy who talked about championing the Second Amendment, whose supporters told us for over a year, you don't have to worry about trying to nullify federal gun control, just get on the Trump train. Don't worry about it. It's going to be done starting January 1st. And that was 2017. We heard this over and over and over and over. Just support this. What are you, on the wrong team? What do you like, Hillary? You know, well, my view is that in that climate, the absolute worst case scenario that's acceptable is that it stays the same as Obama. That, to me, is the worst case scenario, that it just stops getting worse. That's the only thing that I would even consider being like, okay, it's a decent start. It's no longer bleeding. Now, well, bleeding is badly. Let's cover the wound,
Right.
And then let's start fixing it. The fact of the matter is, it actually went beyond that. So the enforcement measures have gone up. More unconstitutional gun control is being enforced by the federal government. So if Trump is oblivious to that, then that's a problem. And if he is on board with it, that's also a problem. And the end result is the same. So I guess we'll see over the next couple of years. Maybe that will turn around. We know for a fact that the Obama administration was the worst in history in his first term on marijuana enforcement,
Yes, he was.
but not on the second term. So it's possible that this could turn around. I guess a big part of it is going to be us making noise. It's going to be Trump supporters making noise about this. Instead of being mad that we're telling them that this is happening, be mad at the ATF and say, hey, Mr. Trump, Mr. President, why don't you stop this rogue ATF from violating your campaign promises? So whether he's a good guy, I don't know what his motivations are. I don't know what his motivations are on the right to keep and bear arms. I know he's called for gun control in the past. He called for the bump stock ban.
Yes, he did.
Currently, that's also bad and unconstitutional. So I see bad motives, but I would drop that as long as he turns it around.
Yeah. So talk to your guy. If Trump is your guy, talk to your guy.
Tell him you don't want any more gun control. No more, and that means not just adding to the laws on the books, but slowing down and ending the enforcement of the ones currently there. So let's go to the next one. War powers has also been pretty bad. Mike, you and I have covered this. We've talked about the fact that we both like the fact that Trump went to North Korea to do something that no other president has ever done, meet with the leader of North Korea. It's always better to have a handshake than to threaten to punch someone in the face.
Yeah.
That's a better scenario. It is
Absolutely.
not a fix, but it's a better scenario. So the metric that we've looked at is the number of bombs dropped. George Bush dropped 70,000 bombs in his 2 terms. That's an average of what, just like 9,000 bombs per year. Then Obama ramped it up because Obama, the peace president, was just a monster. Dropped 100,000 bombs in his 2 terms. That's what, like 10,000 per year, 12,000 a year. Now, in Trump's first term, or first year in office, 2017, there were 44,000 bombs dropped. So almost 4 times the amount that the awful Barack Obama did. Now, he can turn this around. Some people tell us that the reason he's doing that is to ramp it up right away, pound it out, put an end to it instead of this slow, ongoing warfare. Now, if that plays out like that, and he ends up dropping like less bombs than Bush did, he's really going to have to cut that back.
Yeah.
Then we'll say he's not as bad as George Bush. So it would be good in the long run if he turned. I mean, obviously, we can't make any definitive statements on any of these issues, but certainly we see the trend. It continues getting worse and worse and worse. Now, this is the 3rd issue in a row of something that we cover on where they're getting worse.
Yeah, and this one, this one bothers me more than the other ones because when you think about the fact that there are human beings under all of those bombs, this is just a human tragedy. I was reading today an article about the recent bombing in Yemen, and that wasn't directly U.S. forces; it was Saudi forces, but using American munitions, using American support. These are our allies. These are the guys that we call the good guys. And
they're client state.
Yeah. They blew up basically a bunch of school children. And I don't know, it's just, it's heartbreaking to see this kind of thing. And it's heartbreaking to see the callousness of people that can just turn their other way. When we have a shooting in a school in the United States, we want to ban guns. Why don't we want to ban bombs when you're bombing kids in Yemen,
Yeah.
I guess because they're in Yemen, but I don't know. Maybe that's a little bit of a dovetail, but
no. American foreign policy has been evil, 100% evil for a long time. It was very difficult for me to come to that realization. I was a very pro-America. I came to tears when I realized, I looked back and I learned the history, all the times the CIA has overthrown people, and then dictators get installed, and then people have revolutions. Iran is a great example of this. There's a lot of hatred towards the U.S. because of the meddling in their affairs. So U.S. foreign policy is bad. The warfare state is bad. And I believe that much of what they do overseas, from the surveillance to drone patrols and things like that, they end up bringing home here. The gun control that they put on other nations, they want to put on us here. So this is bad news. We will certainly be keeping an eye on this. And some people asked us the same kind of thing. Oh, these numbers are made up. We heard the same thing on this one, Mike. I saw emails, and I had to point them to, and of course you never get a response when you say, well, we got the numbers from U.S. Air Force Central Command.
Right.
They're the ones that are publishing this information. They're like, oh, some guy wrote and said, the only place I found this was on some blog on maybe BuzzFeed or something like that, and BuzzFeed can't be trusted. And BuzzFeed is filled with partisan hacks. But when I went to look at that BuzzFeed article that he found, it directed me to the link to the United States Air Force Central Command, where we found all the other data. So the U.S. Air Force Central Command is either part of the liberal establishment lying to us to try to make the Trump administration look bad, or things are just not going the way that people want to believe it to be. The Republicans are not doing a good job. And that maybe leads me, and you talk about the callousness of this, that leads me to maybe the mainstream Republican mindset is maybe pretty awful when it comes to general views on the Constitution and liberty. And this comes from Joe Wolverton did a pretty good report on this for the New American that we reposted on our site. There was a poll done over at Ipsos just last week, and it says that 43% of self-identified Republicans believe, quote, the president should have the authority to close news outlets engaged in bad behavior, end quote. Bad behavior. Just a broad statement about news outlets that are bad. The president should have the power to unilaterally shut those down.
Sounds a little bit like the Alien and Sedition Acts, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's exactly what they did. And Thomas Jefferson thought it was one of the worst things that they could have done. So did James Madison. Judge Andrew Napolitano a few years ago in a speech referred to the Patriot Act as the worst law passed in Washington, D.C. since the Alien and Sedition Acts. So this is one of the worst things passed in American history, and 43% of Republicans want to see it implemented.
That just shows the power of rhetoric. You know, we've been hearing for, the last 2 years about fake news, news.
Well, the media is terrible.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there's no question about that.
But that's amazing. I remember being in in the 90s here in LA, all of our cab drivers were Russian. Now a lot of them are Armenian. I mean, you get all kinds of driving Uber, you get but almost every single time I was in a cab, I was with a Russian, and they always knew more about politics than most of my neighbors and friends, about American politics and American history and foreign policy. They knew a lot. And over and over from various different people, you'd get drivers saying things like, oh, you know, in Russia, we have, my accent, I shouldn't even do this. Someone's going to call me a racist pig. They would basically say, in Russia, we have Pravda. And everybody knew it was bullshit. It was propaganda. But here in the U.S., you read these newspapers and you guys all fall for it. What are you, stupid? So at least the positive thing, I think the rhetoric from Trump attacking the media has been very positive. It has encouraged people to come out of the shadows and talk trash about CNN, hopefully Fox, ABC, NBC, BuzzFeed, all of them. Don't trust them. Read a bunch of stuff, get as much information, and trust yourself.
Yeah, and that's what I was getting ready to say. I mean,
sorry.
I come from a journalism background.
Yes.
And so I'm probably more sympathetic to the media than a lot of people watching are, because I've been on the inside of it, and I know that it's not quite as bad. I'm not saying it's not bad, okay? Don't go, Mike Maharrey said the media is good. No, I didn't say that. I'm saying it's not as bad as some people make it out. And there are a lot of good people that are out there. You just have to find those good people. And it's like anything else. You need to read a lot of different sources. You don't want to trust Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or the Washington Post. But that doesn't mean that you can't find something that's good in the Washington Post. Like, what's the guy's name who does all the reporting on police militarization? Branko?
I can't think of his name. He used to write for Reason.
Yeah, and he's right there in the Washington Post. So, or you can pick up the USA Today.
Walter Block. I just read an op-ed column in the New York Times.
So, and so let's think about this a minute. You shut down the New York Times, and you might shut down 99% bullshit, but you're also shutting down Walter Block having an opportunity to reach a bunch of leftists.
Yes, which is actually probably more important.
So the bottom line is that when it comes to media, when you start giving the government the power to pick and choose and decide what is a bad actor and what is a good actor, you're heading down a road of trouble. And eventually, it's just like every other government power. Eventually, it's going to get turned on you. It's going to get turned on the people that you like. And it's like that whole thing with Alex Jones and him getting, kicked off of all these platforms. And a lot of people say, oh, I don't care because it's Alex Jones and Alex Jones is a nut. Well,
yeah, but now he's getting even more attention. Like, if you really don't like Alex Jones, turn him off. We all have filters.
Yeah.
We can easily click away from something. The internet is a vast place. Don't listen to the guy. I mean, this is the idea that people are too stupid to make choices for themselves, and it's the arrogance of the elite that says that we can't make our choices. Now, a lot of people, and I've heard, that this is just coming from the progressive left and they just want to shut down things. But this poll says otherwise. Republicans want to, people are registered as Republicans, want the president to have the power to shut down bad actors in the media. They actually took it even further. One other question that I thought was incredibly alarming. There was a question, should President Trump close down mainstream news outlets such as CNN, The Washington Post, and The New York Times? Very specifically, should these be shut down? The report, or the Ipsos poll, almost suggested in their report that it was basically like, oh, what a relief. Only 23% of Republicans wanted to do this.
It's like 1 in 4.
I'm thinking, holy crap, 1 in 4 want the president to shut down specific news outlets. What do you think's going to happen when Elizabeth Warren is president, or whoever on the left is going to be president at some point in the future? What do you think they're going to do with that power? I mean, are self-identified Republicans morons? I mean, economically, self-identified Democrats are complete idiots. Clearly, the short-sighted vision of this, my guy's in power, so let's let him do all whatever, and then not even think about what the next person can do with it. That was the whole structure that the founders created, was, okay, the reason to limit power is because you never know what the next person's going to do with it. You don't trust the current person to do whatever because the next one's going to be bad. And it seems like a significant portion of people don't recognize that.
You know, and it's interesting because I think a lot of people on the left, I'll say they should have learned this lesson when Trump was elected, because we've seen so many of the things that the left has complained about Trump doing. The stage was set with Barack Obama, or not just Barack Obama. I mean, we can go back as far back as you want. The past president sets the precedent. The past president sets the precedent for the future president. So, and you know, a friend of mine, this is an awesome. She was relating this to surveillance, but it kind of fits with anything. She said, any power that you want to give the government, you should ask yourself the question, would you want your creepy ex to have that same power?
That's amazing.
And she was talking about surveillance, which it really works for them. But think about anything. Would you want your creepy ex to have the power to do whatever it is that you want the government to do? You know, do you want your creepy ex to have the power to feed your kids? Do you want your creepy ex to have the power to dictate your health care? You ask that question, and it kind of brings things into a pretty good perspective. So I don't want my creepy ex controlling what news outlets I can see or not see.
So sometime in the near future, we're definitely going to pull apart some other issues. We're going to talk about surveillance. We're going to talk about marijuana drug prohibition enforcement. We're going to look at that. We haven't looked at these yet. I mean, we know that surveillance has gotten worse. Well, let's look at asset forfeiture, the equitable sharing program. What are some of the other things that we should cover?
Well, you said marijuana enforcement.
Yep. Forfeiture, spying.
Jeff says he wanted to
well, he's talking about it, but the question is, are they actually doing it?
Did they do it?
So that's why I think this whole episode to me is so important, because the rhetoric has been, oh, let's talk about Obamacare. Last week on Good Morning Liberty, I covered this report from Vox that was talking about how there's cities suing the Trump administration for not enforcing parts of Obamacare or taking action to undermine it. So we haven't looked in it, so I kind of just took it as, well, let's say what they're saying is true. Well, if it is true, that's positive. So maybe there are some things that are positive. Let's look at the things that we've been covering over the years. I think Obamacare, surveillance is a good one. The drug war is another one. Forfeiture. Maybe those are the next 4 that we look at. And then at some point, maybe we'll do some full coverage, a report, like how Republicans doing in Washington, D.C. I can see some areas where maybe things are better, but I think the numbers is what we really have to look at.
And if any of you folks are watching and there's something that you're interested in that we could look into.
Common Core.
Yeah.
Common Core is another one. But yeah, we'll look into that. Maybe not next episode, which will probably be in 2 weeks, but sometime before the legislative sessions start in the fall for a number of states. But I think it'd be good to kind of cover that to see how things are going on other things. I think it's also important to note that, no, it's not just Republicans that are a problem, but certainly my message on this is if, as we were told so often by so many people, electing Republicans across the board was going to solve a lot of these problems. Clearly it isn't. That means the strategy has to be different. We will obviously pivot into the strategy on how to deal with things. If you keep watching this show, you'll see it play out in practice. And I guess that kind of covers it for today, of course.
Yeah.
Mike, you got any closing things?
Yeah, I remember something that you said years ago that stuck with me that I think wraps up this segment.
This a good one?
It is a good one.
Okay.
This was back, I think, probably the first presidential election where I was with TAC, and I remember you saying, I think it was Romney. That was the one the Republicans were saying, this is the most important election of a lifetime. And I remember you saying that I will guarantee you in 1 year after this election, no matter who is elected, the federal government will be bigger, it will be deeper in debt, it will be more powerful, and it will be violating more of your rights. Doesn't matter which one of these people is elected. And I think this really bears that out. What we've been talking about today bears that out. Everybody told us that we had to get Trump because Hillary was going to be awful, and nobody's arguing that Hillary wouldn't have been awful. But regardless, no matter what, you still get more federal government, more spending, more debt, and more loss of liberty. So we need to quit focusing on these presidents and these people in Washington, D.C., and get our focus back on this strategy, which is limiting federal power through state action. All this national politics stuff is dumb.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's a failed strategy, and I think that's the message more than just hammering on Republicans or hammering on Democrats. The strategy of dealing with issues in Washington, D.C. doesn't work. I do have to give a hat tip to, rest in peace, Harry Brown on that. I stole that whole concept from him where he wrote an article some elections ago where he said, oh, well, there's the result of the election, blah, 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 government's worse, it's going to get worse, blah, blah, blah. Guess what? I wrote this last week before the election. So that happens year in and year out. We can see this on a number of issues. We'll be covering others in the future. Of course, if you like what we're doing, make sure to like and share, subscribe to us, follow us, leave some comments of some things you'd like to see us cover in the future. And of course, go to 10thamendmentcenter.com/support if you are not already a member to join us for as little as $2 a month. We'll see you guys next time on 10th or Tuesday. Thank you so much for watching.